Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for Cord Connects for our special holiday edition. I want to welcome Mei Lee, Bree C., and Carol DerSarkissian, who are all currently at NYU in various roles and who are going to give us an introduction, overview of extended reality for medical student education with steps and barriers to success in setting up XR at your institution addressed. Thank you, ladies. I am very excited about hearing about this.
Thanks, Marianne. And thanks to everyone for joining us and taking an hour away from like making your snowmen or shoveling snow like I was doing if you're in the Northeast. And thanks to Marianne for inviting us to give this talk because we were pretty disappointed in March when we were unable to attend Cord, but little did we know what we had ahead of us in New York City in the next few months. But here we are in a much more fitting platform for the topic of our talk, which we've titled, Bree, I'm going to have you go back to just the original slide, Reality Doesn't Bite, Delivering Medical Education Through Extended and Virtual Reality Simulation. And this is all about virtual reality, not about the reality of the last year, because that really did bite. I added extended reality to the title because, as Carol will talk about in a few minutes, extended reality incorporates all real and virtual realities combined that are generated by computer technology. So none of us has any financial disclosures or conflicts of interest to disclose. Originally, I think when we prepared this talk for live audiences, I was going to use this slide to weed out all the millennials and kick them out of the room. But I'm not going to do that now, but just so you know. So this is a brief outline of what we're hoping to cover in this talk. A caveat that it is by no means a comprehensive review of all the possible uses of XR and VR in MedEd. But even though this is a relatively new format in MedEd, it also has many existing entry points, all the way from being used in early medical school curriculum, such as an anatomy class, to functioning as even a continuing education tool that can give experienced practitioners a chance to refine their skills. So Carol's first going to go over what exactly is XR and VR and why I'm using those terms interchangeably, which I probably shouldn't be. Bree will go over why we would even consider using XR in MedEd, and then talk more specifically about how we brought in VR and XR into our own clerkship at NYU. And then I'll go over some of the challenges of using VR and XR, as well as talking through the tools and preparation that you'll need to sort of overcome those challenges and try to implement XR at your own shop. And then finally, we'll touch briefly on whether the COVID landscape lends itself more or less to the use of VR and XR within MedEd, and whether we should consider investing more in the tool given our current learning environment.
All right, so as May mentioned, we're going to start by talking about, well, what exactly is XR? XR stands for extended reality, and this is an emerging umbrella term for all the immersive technologies, from augmented reality, which is AR, to virtual reality, which is VR. And all these immersive technologies extend our real reality and by mixing it with the virtual world. And depending on how immersive it is, you can get low presence or high presence. So in terms of augmented reality, this is where you bring virtual information and objects into your actual real world. And you're using either a tablet or a phone, and Pokemon Go is one example. With this, you have low presence. On the other end of the spectrum, where we have more immersive VR, we have high presence. This allows the individual to put on a headset, which is also known as the head-mounted display, and you're immersed in this virtual, three-dimensional, 360 world, and your mind is fooled into thinking that you can walk on the moon, or you can swim with the dolphins, or you're in a virtual emergency department with a virtual patient. Next slide. So why VR? As educators, one of our greatest needs is to have this learner take all this theoretical practice in medicine that they've learned and translate it into the clinical practice of medicine to the patient that's right in front of them. So we use XR to address this need. Next slide. So there are many different ways that you can use XR in medical education, and I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of them that are the most common ways. Anatomy pathology lends itself very well to using XR in medical education. As you probably know, there are a number of medical schools that no longer have students dissecting cadavers. Another one is surgical training. Put on the headset, immerse yourself in a virtual OR, and go through the procedure. Orthopedics is a very common use of this. The next one is empathy training. You can put on a headset and embody a patient with Alzheimer's or macular degeneration, and then live a day in the life of this patient and experience what they are experiencing. And the last one I'm going to mention is virtual patient simulation is what we used. Immerse the learner in a virtual clinical setting and have a virtual patient in front of them, and they take care of this patient as they would at a bedside of a real patient. Next slide. So a good example of using VR for anatomy and pathology is the NY Living Anatomy. As you can see here, we use AR on the upper left-hand corner, head and neck anatomy, and they also use VR, as you see on the bottom, and mostly using it to connect the anatomy to the clinical relevance. Next slide. A very good one for ACLS VR training is Health Scholars. Health Scholars did a study with Mount Sinai here in New York City, and what they have is 13 different kind of arrhythmias, stable, unstable, cardiac arrest. And what you do is you immerse the learner in this clinical setting, and they are the team leader. What's really interesting about this one is that you have eye tracking and you have voice recognition. So if you want Joe to start compressions, you have to look at Joe and you have to actually use the word and say, Joe, start compressions. And then Joe, the virtual Joe, will start doing compressions. So this is very interesting because not only does it teach you how to take care of these arrhythmias in this patient, but it also reinforces good communication skills during a code. Next slide. Then we have fundamental VR. They call themselves the surgical flight simulator. And this is being used at NYU by the orthopedics department. And they've done a small study and now they have a grant for another study. What's really robust about this experience is not only is the learner wearing the headset and you see on the left lower corner performing a knee replacement, but they have haptics. And what haptics are the sensations that you feel as you're in this virtual world. And this is done through, if you look at his hand, on the right-hand side, it looks like he has a robotic hand. On the left-hand side, he's holding instruments. So as he's going through the procedure, he feels what he's doing, and he feels the drill going and the resistance that he feels. And with this, you also have, step-by-step, you have some questions that they have to answer. So this makes it a very robust and comprehensive experience. Next slide.
So thinking about XR in medical education, medical schools are constantly looking to innovate our educational methods and design, and XR provides a medium which allows for a variety of clinical topics, flexibility with different learner levels, and a wide range of involvement all the way from just observation to complex interaction. While more research is needed, especially to examine the external validity of XR to see how well it is replicated in the clinical arena, we are encouraged by our own experience with our students here, so we want to share it with you guys at Cord. As you can imagine, XR is particularly challenging to study because the technology and software are so diverse, so we would need appropriately powered RCTs in order to take into account that diversity. Here's just a snapshot. You can actually see Carol in the photo on the left with a bunch of our medical students doing XR earlier pre-COVID when they're allowed to sit this close together. So why did the NYU Emergency Medicine UME team consider trialing XR? To answer that question, we'll just give a quick overview of our EM selective so you get a sense of the type of students we're hoping to use it with. So our emergency medicine selective is just our introduction to emergency medicine. Each rotation is 4 weeks. We hold it 12 months a year. Our learners range from MS2s, MS3s to MS4s. any medical student who wants to do our sub-I, what we call our advanced elective in emergency medicine, has to do the 4-week emergency medicine selective first. Our goal is really just to introduce anyone and everyone to emergency medicine. Our curriculum already includes clinical shifts, obviously, procedure workshops, EKG workshops, community outreach, didactics, conference, exams, and 3 high-fidelity sim sessions. So why were we looking to add even more to that? Well, we wanted to think about other ways we could address all our different learner levels. As you can imagine, we have a wide range of learners on our selective. First off, the student who has just completed preclinical requirements, has never really talked to a real life patient, and needs a framework for how to approach a patient, obtain an HPI, an exam, and needs to learn how to develop an assessment and plan, right? Then we have our moderately seasoned MS3 medical students. They probably completed a few rotations, they're exploring different fields, including EM, and some are actually 4th years who decided to apply to ortho or internal medicine, but just want to see things from the perspective of the ED. They know how to work up patients in general, but they're learning how to do it as EM providers. And finally, we have our students who are gung-ho emergency medicine. They can't wait to show off their stuff and get their hands dirty. Some are former EMTs, some have been dreaming about being an ER doc since they were little, and they already love ketamine. They're excited to do anything and everything EM. So, wide range. So, we strive to meet each learner where they are in terms of fund of knowledge, confidence, and experience. In terms of bread and butter cases, we want all of our students on our introductory class rotation to learn how to work up and manage all the bread and butter cases, right? So chest pain, abdominal pain, vaginal bleeding, but this is not guaranteed for every single student. It depends on shift, their site, where they're working more so, COVID cases, and sometimes just luck. Another challenge, sick patients, right? So we want all of our students to learn about high-risk sick patients, but you can't just take a second-year medical student who's never talked to a real-life patient and throw them in the middle of a pediatric code. Fourth, learning how to work both independently and in a team are key to being successful in the ED, but this can be really difficult with no prior experience when you come out of the classroom. And finally, since NYU School of Medicine started subsidizing tuition and now it's free for all the students, the class sizes had to decrease enrollment, appropriately so, and therefore our rotations have decreased. This proves challenging for certain educational activities. So how do we think that XR could actually rise up and meet some of these challenges? Let me tell you about a couple of them. So first of all, we love high fidelity sim, but one challenge is actually buying into the reality of the clinical scenario, right? XR, when you're wearing the helmet and you're immersed in that environment, tends to make users believe they're actually in the environment rather than in a sim classroom with a mannequin. Second of all, because each student first experienced XR independently while the other students observe them, then they debrief together. Each learner is met at their own level and pace, and then they learn how to work and talk together with the discussion and feedback as a team. Third of all, in terms of the full portfolio of cases that I was talking about, the bread and butter cases, if a student happens to go through the entire rotation and just never got to see a vaginal bleed, XR allows them to supplement their portfolio of chief complaints with that missing case. XR cases in your portfolio would be standardized and repeatable, so you can ensure that all the students get the same educational experience if they're missing those cases. In terms of the really scary cases, XR, like SIM, provides a safe space to learn them. You can run that pediatric code right through their headset and have them go through it in a safe space. And finally, like I was talking about with our smaller numbers at NYU School of Medicine and therefore our smaller rotation numbers, you can run XR with even just a few students. Normally during a sim, we tend to have like 1 or 2 doctors, a consultant, maybe a nurse or 2, a tech, but with XR, it's actually each student is wearing their headset and experiencing the case first in that way, and then you get a group discuss with however many students you want.
Okay, so what did our experience look like for the selective students? Can you click the slide again? So we used Oxford Medical Simulation, also known as OMS. And this is what it looks like inside the headset. You you're put into this virtual emergency department. You have a virtual patient, a virtual nurse, and you can go ahead and examine the patient. You can take a history, you can order labs, you could diagnose and treat just like you would at the bedside of a real patient. And for our experience, we used a GI bleed, an unstable GI bleed experience. Next slide. So that's what it looked like on the inside of the classroom and the inside of the headset. This is what it looked like in the classroom on the outside. As I said, each student would go through the case on their own. There was multiple VR stations that we had set up. Some students preferred to stand, some students felt comfortable sitting, and other students could watch the other student take care of the patient as they were going through the experience. Next slide. And this is what they had to say about the experience.
My name is Mark Court. I'm an MS4, and this was absolutely an awesome experience. I think there's really limited chances to get to try out being a doctor and being an independent physician and taking care of someone by yourself. And this is really an opportunity to do that at a very early stage and make mistakes and see why you don't do certain things and why you should do others. I think this should be done really earlier in our curriculum, all the way starting in first year. And I think it would be really, really helpful for helping us grow and take care of our patients in the future.
Okay, next slide. And something that you can experience with VR is called cyber sickness, whether you feel nauseous or you feel a bit of vertigo. And this is what the student said about that.
I did feel a little bit of dizziness and disorientation when I was at first getting oriented to the software. And so I could see that being a barrier for future students, especially for those who might have a slightly more intense reaction. However, I do think I acclimated pretty quickly, and I wouldn't say that I came away from the experience feeling that it was clouded in any way by that. But I do definitely feel that the educational value of the experience kind of outweighed any mild physical discomfort I may have experienced.
So most of our students
a little bit of dizziness and disorientation when I was.
So most of our students recognize the value of this XR experience. So we also did a pre-experience and post-experience survey. And what we asked them was, how comfortable do you feel managing patients with GI bleeding? And pre-experience, we had almost equal number of students who said they felt comfortable as opposed to uncomfortable, and very few that felt neutral about it. After the experience, those numbers of comfortable, uncomfortable went down, and people moved more towards the middle. And so how do we interpret this data? Are the students using this VR experience as a personal assessment tool? Do they go through the experience and then realize how much they know or they don't know? So next slide. We also asked, does this VR experience increase your confidence in managing unstable GI bleed patients? And majority said yes. Next slide. And we also asked them, would they like more topics using VR as a learning tool in medical school? And again, the majority said yes. So if the students like it and they want more of it, how do you implement this into your program? Next slide.
Sorry. So yeah, despite the overwhelming popularity of the VR platform at NYU, how we can sort of move that into actual research and data, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But just in general, implementing it at your institution is certainly has its hurdles. So one of the first considerations is cost, and whether your department chair will budget for such costly equipment. Especially in the COVID world, which Bree is going to talk about in a few minutes. Sharing equipment requires a vigorous sanitizing process that is not cheap. The ideal is that each learner can own his or her own headset, or at least borrow a headset for the entirety of the clerkship, which is often about 4 weeks. And right now, headsets can cost anywhere between $400 and $2,000. So you can see how this would be potentially a tough sell to your department leadership. But I would almost argue that budget is in some ways the last challenge you want to tackle, because in order to even decide whether any investment should be made, you have to first anticipate how you'll overcome the other logistic challenges, and there are a few. One of these is keeping up with the software and the rapidly changing platforms. And the good news is that right now, there are probably only a handful of hardware VR developers that are being used in med ed. And so many of the software companies are working within that framework. but it's important before venturing deeper into it to get a sense of what software currently exists and find out whether you're borrowing or buying the license for the software, what those licensing fees are, and just being aware that like everything else in the tech world, software changes, and with that costs can accrue. Another challenge is making sure that all of your faculty, or at least the faculty who will be directly teaching your XR and VR platforms, can receive the specific training that enables them to sort of effectively operate the VR platforms. Unlike even something like high fidelity sim or mannequins, VR and XR is not necessarily intuitive. So depending on how tech savvy your faculty member is, this can be a big time and resource strain. So keep that in mind as well. Administrative logistics. So this kind of circles back to what I was just mentioning in terms of the changing software platforms. In general, I think tech-based learning tools like VR, XR require a fair amount of administrative maintenance and support. So just managing things like login information, performance tracking, data management, that sort of has to happen on a continuing basis. And again, because of the heavy tech nature of VR, your sort of usual go-to residency program coordinator might not be able to figure that out. Things like the technological barriers like firewalls, things like that. So you'll probably need more of an IT type manager or someone similar to be the administrative point person. So keep that in mind as well. And then what we saw with the video of the student, physical barriers for the learner. You saw that can lead to some physical discomfort for the learner. So you'll want to keep that in mind. Again, reports of vertigo, motion sickness from this type of learning platform will have to be considered. So you're going to have to build in a backup for students who just physically can't tolerate using the VR headsets. And finally, what I think is probably one of the biggest barriers, and what Carol was sort of touching on, is in order to effectively implement VR and XR at your institution, you're really going to need buy-in. And in order to do that, we're going to need a lot more data. So right now, there's a lack of a large multi-centered evidence that this learning platform even works. Informally, as you saw from Carol's graphs, students found VR learning really useful and fun, and they seem to want more of it. But I think until research can link VR training to either improved patient outcomes or point to its efficacy as a teaching tool for students or residents, your healthcare system, your chair, may still not be motivated to provide significant funding and time support for its implementation. So this last point, I think, is really important for us all in terms of collaboration. Next slide. But now that we've sort of talked about some of the challenges, I think there are certain steps to success that you can take to try to start implementing XR and VR into your own curriculum. One of the most important first steps is to just identify your teaching goals. Like we've discussed, VR can be used in so many ways, whether it's to improve a procedural skill, teach patient empathy, gain experience with rare clinical scenarios like disaster drills, or even just be used to standardize assessments and learner assessments. But most importantly, it's important to just have a clear idea of how it's going to add or support to your current didactic tool set. And the more specific you are, the better. From our own experience, unless you have a clear goal of what you're trying to achieve didactically, it can easily sort of devolve into a let's just try out this cool piece of gaming equipment without necessarily advancing your specific learning goals. So specific is what we would emphasize. To that end, you also want to be judicious about which learners you start with, identify who they are. I tend to think that undergraduate medical students are a good starting off point. First, because you can get the support of the medical school, which often has its own tech division, but also because these students, depending on where they are in their training, haven't really had the exposure to procedures or high stakes clinical scenarios that VR and XR might allow them to experience. And also, potentially because of their age, they're often more tech savvy, which just makes this a little bit of an easier sell for them. You want to be realistic about the time and degree of faculty involvement. Again, because this is such a specific type of platform that's not necessarily intuitive, you don't want to expect your usual med ed leadership to sort of take the helm on this. You'll probably only have one or two faculty members who either have the background knowledge or the motivation to take the initial lift on implementing it, and sort of honing it before it becomes transferable to the rest of your education faculty. So you're not going to necessarily rely on the usual people, but you want to identify people who sort of either have background in this or are really motivated about it. You also really want to get friendly with your medical school's IT department. So if you are part of a department that is attached to a medical school, we'd really sort of recommend that you tap them and collaborate with them as much as possible. We're lucky because NYU has a really great medical innovations department or institute, and collaborating with them has really helped us get started without having to initially use our own department's resources. So I think back a few slides, Greg DerSarkissian, he's our director of multimedia for the Medical Schools Innovations Institute. He really helped spearhead the medical schools venture into XR and VR, and we were able to piggyback on his and Carol's work, and that made implementing this into our own EM curriculum much, much easier. And sort of in that same vein, because there is such a high initial overhead cost of time and money, it's a good idea to collaborate with other departments, especially for research purposes. So given that there's initially a relatively small number of learners and faculty per department in terms of onboarding with VR, if you collaborate with other departments, I think you can start generating the statistical power required to either publish or to find actual data to assess the effectiveness of VR. So collaborating with other departments can certainly lead to better and more research. Next slide. So this slide is just emphasizing that your best chance for success is to collaborate with a tech expert, a curriculum expert, and your department higher ups and those who control the purse strings, so that it's really, like I keep saying, a collaboration. Next slide. And this is just a nice slide, I think, outlining the flow of how implementing XR and VR at your institution might work. Again, you want to first identify the specific need that you're trying to address, and then figure out how that'll work in your educational workflow, whether it's incorporating it in resident conference multimodal day or using it for intern boot camp, something like that. Then being able to prep your faculty and your learner together, perhaps running a pilot and then reevaluating what worked and what didn't. And then finally, once that's sort of done, to start putting into place the logistics and the administrative structure that'll help you maintain the platform. Because like I said, maintenance is a really big part of how this will work successfully. Next slide.
So now that we've given you an overview of what XR is, what XR looks like in medical education, and specifically our experience at NYU, we just wanted to do one last highlight about how XR can be useful during COVID, right? So as a disclaimer, we absolutely do not want to say, oh, XR can replace real live patient encounters, clinical experience, but it can be a nice adjunct to your curriculum, especially during COVID. There are three main considerations I just want to talk about. The first thing is, obviously we've all had to master Zoom these past 9 months. So educators and students are a lot more comfortable with remote platform now. We're not at this stage yet, but if XR headsets became more affordable and they became lighter, we could even allow students to borrow them for the month, experience their cases remotely at home, and then everyone debrief together on Zoom in this familiar platform. The second consideration is that obviously, like all of you, you had your medical students out of the ED during March, April, May, June, essentially. When our NYU students returned to the emergency department, there were very specific rules about what they had to wear, the PPE, and what kind of patients they could see, right? So the deans mandated that actually our medical students were not allowed to see any patients, obviously in the COVID unit side of the ED, but also any patient that came in with respiratory distress, initially fever, and that kind of went away when COVID kind of got better. But shortness of breath and respiratory distress are huge teaching points in emergency medicine, right? Every student, every ER doctors know how to work those things up. So if you're taking away that huge chunk of patient population, it makes it really challenging to just teach students about that. We're considering we're working on writing a COVID case for a high fidelity sim that ultimately we could turn into an XR case so that students can safely learn how to work up and manage COVID patients, which they can't do right now safely. And the final consideration, which May alluded to earlier, was that obviously we have to be 6 feet apart as much as we can. We all have to wear masks. Everything has to be really, really clean. So we need formal protocols for participation and hygiene. Our SIM classrooms now limit the number of students that we can have, and we actually can't use our XR equipment because, I mean, they're headsets that you're putting on your face, close to your mouth and nose, until we have formal protocols in place. So we need an approved disinfecting protocol. The good news is that a user can actually wear a mask under the headset and doesn't interfere at all. It's not like the equipment is pushed up against your face that closely. And as for cleaning, there are different modalities, but one of the more common ones are what we have here, the UV light cleaning boxes. So the one on the left, which is just for a single headset at a time, is like $300. The multi-headset cleaning one on the right would retail for like $1,500. So again, something you probably wouldn't have to think about before COVID, but we should keep that in mind now. So we just wanted to wrap up after giving you the overview of XR and NYU's experience with it and how you can use it during COVID with a light at the end of the tunnel. We just wanted to share with you guys that on Tuesday night, Dr. Louis Goldfrank, who needs no introduction, but our former chair of NYU in Bellevue, got his first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, which we're all really excited. We've been actually forcing him to shelter up at home because he's a little bit older and away from his beloved ED. So this was a huge thing for us, and we're really, really excited for him to get his second dose. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Bree. I think that's, that was it in a nutshell. I think, again, Carol, excluding Carol, Bree and I are not experts about XR and VR, so we really just wanted to bring you our experience and our brief foray into it and what we found to be challenges and things that really worked well. But certainly if you have any questions, I think Dr. Howie's going to be able to field them, or you can always just email us.
Yes, actually, if anybody wants to ask questions directly, feel free. Also, if you wanted to use the chat box, I can moderate it if that's your preferred method. Either way works. I got to tell you, this is fascinating. My 20-year-old just got a VR headset, and we were talking today about how it could possibly be used in education. And to have your talk today was incredibly well timed for me personally, now that I've experienced it a little bit. But I think this could be just blow this wide open. I clearly price is going to be a huge limitation, I would think. And I saw the other obstacles as well, but having come from places that didn't necessarily have a lot of money to spend on things, that the price is a big challenge. How many headsets did you have when, pre-COVID, when you were running a group? How many were you having in a particular classroom or a cycle?
Okay. Well, we had 4 setups, 4 VR stations of Oculus Rift headsets, and the OMS platform runs on the Oculus Rift. However, because of IME and the anatomy program, there are at least another probably 4 really good headsets like those Oculus Rifts, the Quests, and then we have 8 Go's, and that's the one that you saw, which is the gray one in the classroom with all the students sitting there.
But they have, just to be clear, Carol, right? We have 2 different softwares for each set of headsets. So that was the challenge.
Right. So with the Go, we tried out a different software that's from Children's Hospital LA, and those are pediatric cases for anaphylaxis and status. And we kind of piloted it, and the students liked it, but they didn't love it. And then we did OMS, and that has to be on the Rift, and the Quest, which is a new one from Oculus, which is cordless. And so you could do it on both of those. And we have, I would say, about 4 Rifts and about 2 Quests.
So that was a little bit more challenging because if we had, for example, 12 students, we had to figure out a way. This is when when talking about sort of faculty and time resource, we had to figure out a way that was almost like a 3-hour session where we had to stagger them in some ways so that they could each have their, let's say, 10-minute experience and then meet back to do the debrief and go through all the teaching points of the case. So that's where, and we're lucky that we even had those 4 headsets, but, depending on how many students, that was certainly a barrier. We're getting a few questions about software. So like what software were we using to make the cases? And just to confirm, we didn't make the cases, we were using cases that already existed. And who writes the cases for your VR format? Do you have to have a software engineer working with you to make new cases, or can you just purchase simulations?
So there's 2 ways of doing it. You can license the software, such as OMS or Health Scholars, which is the ACLS VR experience. But there are developer kits. So if you have someone like Greg that May mentioned, Greg Dorsonville, he can work with you and come up with something as well with these developer kits. And those cost less than, say, licensing it every year per student, and those are yours. So you have 2 options, but you have to have someone on the IT end who can do it for you.
And then I think, in a case like this, we haven't gone deep in with our simulation division, but we are lucky that we have a simulation division. So, they would be the sort of the natural people to talk with about developing cases for VR. How many hours does it take to create a new case with a developer kit?
I'm not certain on that.
I don't know. We haven't done that.
It spends hours and hours, like he's creating all the anatomy assets, and it takes a very long time to actually scan all those assets and then digitize them. So I can't give you an exact number, but it's a long time.
I mean, I imagine a first step would be taking one of their normal high fidelity simulations and seeing how long it would take purely without even having to reimagine the didactic part of it and the teaching case point, just to be able to translate that directly into VR. So I think that would be sort of a first step, to take an existing case and use your dedicated tech person, or not dedicated tech, and see how long it would take to even just translate the different options and everything, and see how successful that is.
And I think like everything else we do, right? Like high fidelity sim. So our UME team writes some of our own cases, but we also look at the shared free foam, to see what other cases exist out there. Coach just pointed out that it looks like Cornell and Penn work together to create a VR case. So as XR becomes more popular, hopefully there will be like a larger portfolio of standardized, like great high quality cases that we can all sort of reach from. Oh, there he is.
No, but I just want to mention there's the difference between the case they created was more an observation. You get to be in the room, you see the patient go from the ED to the ICU and all the management decisions. But what you guys described was much more interactive. Like you get to make decisions on what's going to happen next and make mistakes. Seems much more like simulation than what they created.
Gotcha.
So what you're probably talking about is what's the difference between 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom. The 3 degrees of freedom is usually just the video where you're watching, and you can create those pretty quickly. However, the 6 degrees of freedom is where you're actually interacting and you're doing the simulation as opposed to just being an observer. So yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But this is, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, if you have a 3D camera, you can create lots of cases. It just won't be interactive.
Exactly.
I mean, even we were working with some medical students over the summer, and this is why I was sort of asking. I think people have to be very specific about where their need lies, because even something, one of our medical students wanted to do a VR headset or a VR case where you just follow one of your patients. And this was an undergraduate, so it's an MS. This was an MS2. He just wanted to follow his patients who were at a public hospital and see how all the barriers that one of the patients needed to go through in order to call, make an appointment, go to get the grocery store, like a day in the life almost of one of your patients, and all the sort of social and economic barriers that he or she faced. And even something like that, I can see having a ton of utility in undergraduate medical education.
I think one of the things that we did at our place was we actually had for the medical students during their little virtual rotation, they bought a GoPro, stuck it on one of our residents who walked into a trauma bay with a mock patient in place. And basically the resident was the hands of the student. And so the student would be able to call out what they should do next. And then afterwards they were able to kind of go through the replay and see what decisions maybe were not the best or support the ones that were very well done. So that was another option in terms of how to do it on the cheap relatively.
And so, Marianne, during COVID, OMS offered a desktop version for free, where you could just go ahead and do these cases on desktop, get a Zoom room full of students and just, as you said, call out the next step and someone would drive the case. And we tried that a couple of times as well. Yeah, that's a good way to go too.
Not nearly as cool as the whole thing though. That's awesome.
No, but we did what we could.
I mean, I also wonder how many students own their own VR headsets just for video gaming. I mean, we could, that's just a thought because I didn't realize that as many people did.
I have adult friends who have them to go mini golfing in the Bahamas, and so even older people have them.
Yeah, I have two in my house.
Yeah, but it would be something that would play to disparities a little bit, right, in terms of education. So I think that's something we'd also have to be cognizant of.
Well, there was a point where NYU was giving iPads to the medical students. Each medical student would get an iPad. So at some point when these become lighter and less expensive, this is something that maybe could be handed out to every medical student.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Brilliant.
I have a question about, do you guys get a sense, because there's a cool factor to this, right? You obviously learn something, it's cool, but could it replace people, right? Like at the end of the day, the medical students want you guys there to coach them, to, walk through a case. This is why, simulation, people love sim. Because there's someone there to debrief with. And I guess my question was, do you guys, does this help reduce the number of people you need, or are you still debriefing with everyone afterwards anyway?
So we debriefed after each session. So each of the students, we'd split them up. They'd all come through, do the cases in VR, and then they'd all come back and we would debrief all together. With health scholars, as I mentioned, Mount Sinai did a small study, and they did mannequin sim versus VR sim, and they found that they were both equally effective. However, they found that there was a cost savings with VR. So it's, the time, the space, so that you take all that into consideration, VR is more cost effective.
And Coach, you mean in terms of faculty, right?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But you can't.
I completely agree, Coach. Like, this should not be something that's like, oh, just take this home and learn on your own, right? I think that there was a project where some students debuted like the butterfly ultrasound and were just told to bring that home and learn it on their desk, with the haptic mouse thing, but like couldn't get coaching at home. And that wasn't particularly successful, right? I totally agree with you. The debriefing and the teaching with the faculty is what really, really brings it all together, I think.
And so that's where you have to ask the question, do you send them home with this and then come back and then they do a mannequin sim and then you debrief? Or do they come in, they do a didactic, they do the mannequin sim, and then you send them home with this just to practice over and over again? And that's something that has to be explored, like what order do you do this in?
But I do love the idea that you guys mentioned that if you have to see a chest pain, a headache, a belly pain, and you happen to miss one of those chief complaints, you could substitute it with VR.
Right.
Without needing a person involved, that just checks the box for their education.
Exactly.
Carol, somebody's asking if anybody's we've experimented with augmented reality sim, AR sim.
Not for emergency medicine, but in anatomy and pathology, we're using AR quite a bit. We're taking the plasticine models and we're digitizing them, and they're using it in AR. So this next one is saying if they can be in different rooms or at home. OMS now has, there's multiplayer as well. And so now OMS has multiplayer where they had, I think, someone in Australia, someone in England taking care of that patient with a GI bleed or sepsis. And so you can have people countries apart in the same scenario working together. So this is where it's moving. Yes.
Right, and obviously that's relevant for COVID protocols.
Okay. Yep.
You know how many schools are using this commonly?
I don't think we have an exact number, but I can tell you this, the West Coast is way ahead of us. USC, UCSS, Stanford, they're all digitizing their anatomy programs, and they're all using it, not just for medical education, but for therapeutic uses too, for like pain and anxiety. So the West Coast is pretty big on it. University of Michigan just a year or two ago put out an initiative to use XR campus-wide. So their medical school and their EM department they're actually creating experiences. So, you know, aside from us, there's Case Western, there's Michigan. So those are the handful of schools right now that are using it quite a bit.
Yeah, and I would argue, I mean, I don't know as much as Carol does about sort of nationwide, but my guess is we really would not have been able to bring it to our clerkship in any form if we did not have the medical school already making inroads, because we just didn't have the bandwidth, the budget, any of that, you know, and this is NYU, which is a big institution, to bring it. So I definitely think a big medical school who's already spearheading it is sort of a good way to get your foot in the door.
And the medical school runs a faculty development course for XR in medical education, and it's also given by Greg. So that's exactly how I was introduced to it. So if you have courses like that and it's being introduced to the faculty, then the interest is piqued and you're like, okay, what can I do with this? But, you know. Yeah.
I got to say, this is absolutely a fantastic topic. Thank you so much. I'm kind of glad that we didn't hear this at Cord, because I think it provided an opportunity for us to kind of see it a little more attentively maybe than we would have in a big room with lots of other people. I think this is a fascinating option in terms of approaching education on so many different levels. I can't thank you guys enough. Thanks so much for joining us today. And if no one else has any questions, I guess we would get to the point where we sign off. But I really want to thank May, Carol, and Bree. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Dr. Howie. Thanks, Coach.
And of course, thank you to Tina for coordinating everything to make this go off without a hitch.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.